Good afternoon and welcome to the Dibble Institute's March 2023 webinar, where we're going to be discussing premarital cohabitation with Drs. Scott Stanley and Galena Rhoads. We're really pleased to have them here with us today. So a few housekeeping items. If you can't hear me, read number one. If you can't hear me during any part of the presentation, please simply log in, log out, or call in. All that information's on your initial invitation. I did want to have you locate your hand, and I'm going to ask you some questions right now. So locate your hand and answer the following questions. Is this your first Dibble webinar? Please raise your hand if you've never, ever before been on a Dibble webinar. I'm just watching the votes come in. People are putting up their hands if they've never been on a Dibble webinar. Okay, well, welcome to all of you who are new to us. And I hope you come back. We do this every second Wednesday. And for those of you who know us, welcome back. We're pleased to have you here. We hope we're a real source of information and thoughtful discussion for you. The next question I have is how many, well, okay, we'll go to that. Okay, so the next question I have is, okay, we're going to put down your hands. Put down all the hands. Okay, so now the second question is, how many of you are familiar, this is in the affirmative, are familiar with our programs Love Notes and Relationship Smarts Plus? How many of you are familiar with those? Because the two speakers today contributed to the body of knowledge that is included in each of those programs. So that'd be super helpful to know. How many of you are familiar? Okay, well, a good number of you are, and many of you are not. So really welcome you to this. And should you want a review copy of either of those programs, please put that information in the question box. Chat box isn't enabled, but if you want a review copy, just let us know through the chat box. We don't have handouts today, but we will be sending you the report that Scott and Galena are talking about when it's completed in the next few weeks, and we will be answering questions. So please drop your questions into the question box. All right, next slide. So these are our beloved founders, Charlie and Helen Dibble. Let's see. Our engineer must be having technical difficulties on her end. Well, I'll just tell you the story. The Dibble Institute was chartered by two people with the last name of Dibble. And they saw that young people were not confident about their long-term capacity to have long-lasting relationships, including marriage. And they also saw how their young friends, their trajectories would change as if their parents' marriage foundered or their parents' relationships became turbulent, it had impacts on children. And so actually Charlie Dibble spoke with Scott Stanley, this would be decades ago, and Scott's colleague, Howard Markman, about the research of the day. And he was told that, there were the key things people were starting to learn about marriage. And then Charlie asked the question of both Scott and Howie and others, how do you convey this to young people? And they were like, we don't know. That's a hard question. So by the way, we're experiencing a few technical difficulties. We'll be getting the slides back up. And until then, you've got me. Anyway, so Charlie started the Dibble Institute, and his idea was to translate research into teaching tools that the internet went out with our engineer. Let me hold you for a brief second here and pull up the slides. Sorry, we're gonna go, oh, now we're back, okay. Anyway, so back to me, back to my story. So the Dibbles, so Charlie Dibble wanted to do something where you could translate research into teaching tools and make those available to others, because that's where he thought he could leverage, you have the most leverage with young people. And indeed, today, next slide, the Dibble Institute is in all 50 states, many of our territories, and we have some overseas projects going on. We're a national independent nonprofit that does not provide direct services. Instead, we rely on people like you, who you are already a client, or you who perhaps someday will be a client. So when we say in the last fiscal year, we served about 120,000 youth, and we do that by a simple math problem of how many manuals we sell and how many workbooks we sell. We really means you. So you have our utmost gratitude because we think this is a really important part of young people's lives. So next slide. Aha, so our mission is to equip young people with the skills and knowledge they need to build agency in their intimate relationships, to really empower them to successfully navigate their romantic lives. And this isn't perhaps the most important thing they need to learn growing up, but it's a critical part of growing up, because having romantic relationships, no matter who you love, is an important developmental marker. And it occurs, in different times and different people. We're not here to say when that happens, but we're one of the few organizations that we know that deals with this important part of agency in intimate relationships. So we think it's, so that's what we do. Okay, next slide. So we have some key values. We're big fans of research. And that's why we have researchers like Scott and Galena on and others. And what we've learned about research is that science or our understandings change over time. And I'm sure Scott's going to cover how our understanding of cohabitation has changed over time. But if you just look at, without pulling a scab off, if we just look about guidance on masks in the pandemic, originally, like, make your cloth mask, that's perfect. And now we're like, cloth masks don't work. Or, you should wear masks here and not there. Anyway, I don't want to get into the weeds on that, except to say, as scientists learn more, they change their guidance. And so ditto here. As we learn more, we change our guidance. And so you can be sure that what you're getting is what we know the most recently. And both the programs I mentioned were just updated in 2022. So pretty darn current. All righty, next slide. So we're big fans of safe, stable, and nurturing families. I can't imagine anybody not. It's a little like apple pie, right? So, it can be a single family, a single parent family, grandparents raising children, a married couple. What's important for outcomes for children, and that's a lot of why many of us are in this field, is what the outcomes are for children, is that it's stable, safe, and nurturing. And, if you look at the statistics, often you see that married and very committed couples provide that environment more than, let's say, people who are bringing partners in more frequently, or who haven't, just sliding, to take some of Scott's sliding into relationships. So we're really pleased to be part of this effort to help young people as they move forward in their lives, create these family units, regardless of how they're arranged, but are safe, stable, and nurturing for the betterment of their children. And finally, we're big, as you can tell, we're big fans of relationship education, and everybody should get a relationship education class. I've had my fair share. My nieces and nephews get them as their wedding presents, lucky them. And so it doesn't matter how old you are, what color you are, where you live, where you come from, who you love. We all can make our relationships better. So, as I say, big fan over here, and hope you join us. All righty, next slide. So I'm pleased to welcome Doctors Scott and Stanley and Galena Rhoads. They're going to turn on the cameras now. Scott and I have known each other for many years. He's a colleague that we have a lot of fun together. And Galena is newer on the team, and that only means she's been here 20 years or something instead of 15, instead of 30 or 40. Anyway, so I'm pleased to have them here today. They're both in Colorado. They're both associated with the University of Denver, and they're also associated with Practical Relationship Education Program. Did I get that right? Sorry. There's so many ways to say prep. Close. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, okay. And so Marlene Pearson, who wrote both Love Notes and Relationship Smarts Plus, integrated their information into the content. And so not only are those programs evidence-based, but the concepts and content of it are also evidence-based. So Galena and Scott have been doing a lot of research on cohabitation over the years. And I'm really eager to hear what they have to say today, what's new in that field. So I'm going to leave it to you guys, and then I'll pop back in later on with questions.
Terrific. Well, thanks for having us here on your webinar. Really delighted to be here. It's a great thing you're doing. It's also really nice to hear the Dibble story. I've heard it, but it's a great story, and it's kind of inspirational about having an idea and getting after it. And then look at you all now. I mean, it's kind of amazing what you're doing. So next slide. So Galena and I are going to talk today about the premarital cohabitation effect and research over time and some of the latest findings on premarital cohabitation. And not more broadly, although we might get into it with questions you all might ask about cohabitation just more in general, but we're really focused on premarital cohabitation in what we'll talk about today. So as a phenomenon, it really took off in the 70s and 80s. And Galena knew this. I hadn't recalled this, but she mentioned this here. The first paper that really talks about it is, do you remember when, Galena?
1972.
Gosh, that's amazing. By who?
Macklin.
Yes.
Eleanor?
This is a Galena quiz show, actually. So, yeah, so way back, early 70s, people started to get curious. Well, this is starting to be a thing. So what does it mean? What's going to happen? And it's an important subject. It's an interesting subject. It's one people argue about, puzzle about, but an estimated 70% of people are going to cohabit before they marry in the US at this point. And one of the things that's actually been stable for decades is 50 to 65%. So the majority of Americans believe that living together before marriage is going to improve their odds in marriage. And in general, I think it's fair to say that 3 decades of research have not supported that belief. There's some quibbles, but that's not really, there's not a lot of support for that belief. Galena, do you want to add to that?
I think it's one of the reasons why this is so important to study and to talk about, why living together is so important in our society, is that most people believe that it will improve their odds. And that makes sense logically if we think about it, right? It comes from a good place of really wanting marriage to be an important decision and wanting to know all of the data, so to speak, that you can know before making that decision to marry someone. So it's one of the reasons that Scott and I have focused on this area for so long, is that it's actionable. It has some very real world implications for people and the decisions that they make in their relationships.
So it's an interesting thing to puzzle about. Well, when so many people believe something that's not really well supported, why? What and why doesn't it work the way people think? And that's kind of the thing that Galena and I have really focused a lot on, along with Howard Markman and other colleagues of ours. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today and give you some of the latest findings. And then we're going to plan for a lot of time in this webinar for you all to ask questions and to have some discussion and back and forth. So next slide. So there's 3 main sort of theories of causation here, things that would explain why it's living together before marriage has generally been associated with greater risk, not less risk. One of those is the thing that runs through everything in this particular literature, which is selection. And selection, when people talk about selection effects in literature like this, they really just mean that it's not about the thing that you think it is. It's not the thing you're looking at. It's that the characteristics of people that tend to do that thing they're already at greater risk. And the people that are already at greater risk are more likely to do the thing that you're focused on, and like in this case, cohabit. So that it's not really about cohabiting, it's about their characteristics. Galena, you want to add to that?
Yeah, it's the kinds of people who would choose to cohabit that may also be at greater risk for divorce, is the theory behind selection.
So that's always in the mix. So if you don't think we said this in this meeting, let's say this. It's always a factor, and it's a big factor in this literature. And so the really interesting question for researchers is, what is their apart from selection. Is it all selection? There's definitely selection. So what else could there be is the thing that we're interested in. The experience explanations, there's one specific example there on that slide, but really the best work on this, and it hasn't been repeated, and it would be great if somebody would do this, goes back over 20 years, where Axon and Barber show that when people cohabit and cohabit longer and cohabit with more people before they marry, their beliefs about marriage and about divorce change. So the experience, the things we do in life, the paths we travel, tends to change how we feel about those things. And there's clear evidence and really well done work, I think, that living together before, well, a lot of cohabitation makes one change and become more accepting of divorce than they were even beforehand. And inertia, I'm going to let Galena start in on that, and then I'll say something, I'll bet.
Great. Well, one of the things I want to point out about selection and experience is that those two theories also suggest that the cohabitation effect, the association between premarital cohabitation and divorce, ought to go away as it becomes more acceptable in our society and more common, that we wouldn't see selection or experience playing a role in that association over time, which, as Scott mentioned, we haven't seen a lot of evidence that association between living together before marriage and divorce has decreased over time. And it's one of the reasons that Scott and I were really interested in coming up with other ideas for what might explain the association between living together and divorce. And it's also one of the key reasons why we decided to do the study that we'll talk about more today. So our theory of inertia really explains why it might be the case that living together before marriage, and especially before a decision to get married, may put a couple at greater risk for divorce later on. So the idea of inertia is really based on commitment theory, which makes the distinction between constraints, which are things that might increase your chances of staying together, even when you might not feel like staying together. You may not feel committed, but external things that might keep you together. We'll give some examples of those. Dedication, the other side of commitment, is the sense that you want to be with this person long term. It's a sense of team, it's a sense of we, it's a desire to be with this person and to work at the relationship going forward. So the idea of inertia is that by living together, you essentially increase constraints ahead of increasing dedication. That is, you increase the things that might keep you together without necessarily increasing the sense that you want to be with this person in the long term. So once you move in together, things like you've signed a lease. So you've now committed on paper to be with this person for a year, although maybe that wasn't quite your mindset in moving in together. Maybe, in fact, you wanted to move in together because you had some uncertainty about the relationship or whether you wanted to be with this person. You're more likely to have a child together once you start living together. You share social networks, you share finances, all these things that may make it harder to break up. But you may be doing that at a time that you haven't yet really decided that this person is part of your future. And that's how we got to really thinking about the timing of when a couple starts living together and when they get married or decide to get married and why that might matter. Essentially, the inertia of living together, those constraints that might keep you together, may be what make you stay in this relationship and get married. And in the long run, those constraints aren't really the things that keep people together, keep people happy in their marriages. Scott, what do you want to add to that?
I don't think I need to add anything to that, except that it really, as Galena says, it really sets up a pretty clear hypothesis about something that might be, it's really in the category of a type of experience explanation, but what could there be net of selection, which would be, doing something that kind of affects the sequence in a way that could put you in a more difficult spot. So the number one thing that we really expected over the years is that if you've already clearly decided, such as by being engaged, you've really worked it out that you know, this is our plan beforehand, then maybe you're not at high risk like the couple that's living together before they've really clarified in a very strong way their plans for marriage, because we wonder about that latter group having more people in it that got stuck, you know, that because of how Galena described it. They increased constraints a lot before the dedication was clear, and yet they still, many of those couples break up, but yet they still went on to marry. They might be at higher risk because maybe that's not even who they would have chosen, or maybe things weren't defined well enough at this critical stage of the relationship developing about a commitment to marriage in the future. Next slide. So we're going to talk about the latest findings on this. As Galena said, so people have thought that the cohabitation effect would go away, and there's, you know, a number of theories about why. If you thinking about the theory that we're talking about and this idea of inertia, we've not really expected the way we look at it anyway to go away, because if living together makes it harder to break up, if that's just fundamentally true compared to everything else being equal, then we don't see how inertia wouldn't be a risk for people that live together before they've really clarified where things are headed. So next slide. We're going to talk about data that was collected last year, and with funding and with support from the Institute for Family Studies, we conducted this survey last year with YouGov with 1,621 people in the analytic sample. It's a national US sample. It's of people that were married for the first time in the years 2010 to 2019. And at the time surveyed, one of the requirements to be in the survey was to be under 50 and under. And the findings we'll talk about today are weighted to match the US population on dimensions such as age, race, ethnicity, education, and geographic region. Now, next slide. So the outcome that we're focused on is marital dissolution, which is either its marriage is intact, or the couple divorced, or is likely permanently separated. The primary analytic models that we're using here are logistic regressions, though in this talk and in the report that we'll put out soon, we translate findings from odds ratios to estimated percentages because odds ratios are an odd thing to understand, or they're not intuitive for a lot of folks. In most of the analyses we do, we control for a lot of other variables, and most of them, everything we control for is something that existed at the time people married. So we're trying not to control for things that would change based on how the marriage is going, that could be factors then that subsequently lead to divorce. We're controlling for things that were already true, they're already there in the couple's lives, that affect the probability of divorce. Everything on that list that we're controlling for there is related to the likelihood of a couple not making it. And so we're controlling for those to more clearly isolate sort of the phenomenon. Galena, do you want to add anything there? We're good. Okay, next slide. So we're just going to get right to some of the findings that will be in this report. So you might wonder, well, of the people that married in the last decade, what's the percentage of people that waited till marriage to live together? And you can see it's 34%. Cohabited before marriage, but only after they had already become engaged as a couple, that's 20%. And cohabited before marriage and before engagement. So that's the three groups we're focused on here. And we're interested in those groups because of the theory that Galena explained, because we expect and have expected for a long time and have found in other studies that the before group is the group at greatest risk because their increasing their constraint. They're taking this step in life before they've really worked out where they're headed and are clear that they're agreeing. So the next slide we're going to show you is the estimated likelihood of divorce. Now here we're just collapsing for simplicity to those that live together before engagement to those that live together after marriage or engagement. Let me comment on a couple of things here, and then we'll talk about this a little bit. First off, the after marriage or the at engagement group, those two groups are really indistinguishable in divorce rates. So they're not statistically significantly different in the divorce rate. So we're just combining them here for this presentation. And what you can see here is that those two groups that we expect to have a lower likelihood of divorce have a lower likelihood of divorce than those who started living together before engagement. If you do the math, that's actually representing about a 48% increase in likelihood of divorce for those who live together before engagement. Now, you can also tell from this, it's not that people that live together after marriage or after engagement don't see their marriages end or don't struggle in marriage. It's that there's an edge for that group over the group that live together before engagement.
Yeah, just a quick summary. So of people who lived together before they got engaged, 34% of them got a divorce. This is, within the first 10 years or so of marriage, given when they got married. And only 23% of those who lived together either after they got engaged or not at all before marriage got a divorce.
So this is really consistent with this theory that we have about inertia. This fits what we expect from it. And in these data, this is controlling for a lot of things that you would presume are related to selection that are, some differences that already exist in these groups. I also should comment, because it's been an ongoing debate and discussion about whether the general did you or did you not live together before marriage effect still exists. There's an important debate that's been going on in the last few years between sociologists about that. And it's a fascinating debate. And we see in this data too, evidence that just the straight up cohabitation effect still exists. Those who live together before marriage as a group are more likely to divorce than those who don't. As you can tell, though, from our theory and from what we say about inertia, we're really interested in particularly this distinction because we think there's a big difference in how commitments develop for the couples in these two groups. And that's our theory, and that's what we test. Now we're going to go on and present briefly two other findings, and then we'll throw it open for discussion and see where we go. Next slide. So one of the things, if you follow our work, that we've talked a lot about, it's also the name of my blog, is sliding versus deciding. And the idea here is, it comes from a couple of studies some time ago, but one of the really great studies in this literature is by Wendy Manning and Pam Smock in 2005. And they interviewed a lot of people that were cohabiting, not married, they were cohabiting. And a qualitative study, they asked them, well, how did you come to be living together? What was the process there? And what they reported is more than half of them could not describe something like, well, we talked about it and talked about what it meant and made a clear decision about it. They described a gradual process, and this happens for a lot of people. You're over there a couple nights a week, you start leaving some stuff, one's over there more nights, they start to get space in the closet, maybe they leave stuff in a drawer, they're over more and more nights. And then maybe somebody's lease is up or some roommates kick somebody out or whatever, and all of a sudden we're living together. But it's not like we talked about it. It's not like we talked about what we're doing or where it was going. We slid into it. So the sliding word really comes from that great paper of theirs. And it also fits another great qualitative study that's around, it was published in around 2000, but the work was done maybe in the early 90s by an Australian researcher named Jo Lindsay. And she doesn't use the word sliding, but she talks really such rich examples about people just sort of kind of ending up living together without it being a clear decision. And generally, when we say sliding versus deciding, we literally mean deciding, talking about what it means, and that's how we measured it here. But we're usually thinking about it in terms of like commitment is a decision. So like you've really decided something about commitment. Here though, we're measuring it really pretty simple. Like they talked about it and made a decision, which you can see is the smallest group here, or they pretty much said they didn't talk at all or didn't make a decision and slid into it.
And I would add on that, you know, the most common answer, I bet many of you could guess what this is, when you ask someone, how did the two of you start living together? The most common answer is, it just sort of happened, which is interesting because the way we think about living together is that it really is a commitment event in the relationship because it increases constraints and it increases the difficulty of breaking up. And if you ask someone, how did you end up getting married? It would be an unacceptable answer, I think, in most cases, to say it just sort of happened. That's not a very romantic answer to what most people would consider a commitment event in a relationship.
Great. Okay, next slide. We're gonna talk a little bit about, well, how those groups differ in terms of divorce. And this is a slide, there's an important note on the bottom of it. This is not adjusted for the covariates. This is just it is weighted, so it's using the weights in the sample, but this is just comparing the likelihood that the marriage dissolved based on whether the person says they slid into it or it was a clear discussion and a decision. And you can see the difference there. And that's a pretty, I think that's a pretty large difference. I mean, that's a 13 percentage point difference between those two groups, as you can see. 34% for those that slid into it, they said their marriages ended, and 21% for those who said they made a decision. Now, why we show you this unadjusted is to make this point. That 13 percentage point difference gets cut in half to 6 points once you throw in the covariates. So once you control for those sort of background pre-existing characteristics that we talked about a little bit ago, that a lot of this goes away, but not all of it goes away. And so our thought about this is this. To some degree, the degree to which people are going to slide into living together is related to a lot of the characteristics that are already true in their life about all those other kinds of things that we talked about, and more things than that, I'm sure. But we also think there's something left there, and Galena just articulated it well, really well. Like, we think moving in together is a commitment event. And even if people are not thinking like it's a dedication commitment event, it's a constraint commitment event. And it is important to talk about it, and particularly at this point in time, to talk about what it means to each of the two partners. Where is this headed? What does this mean? Are you thinking this? Am I thinking this? And for a lot of reasons we can talk about if you all want to raise it in discussion, people don't like to really be that clear at certain stages in relationships these days, and they don't have a lot of talks that it might be good to have. Next slide. One other finding we're going to give you, this is just pretty interesting stuff, is the top reasons people give for why they moved in together in this sample. So 22% say, well, it made sense financially. Now, this is the top reason. They could have had 5 reasons, but what was the top reason driving you? 22% made sense financially. 17% said, well, it's just inconvenient to live apart. 44% said to spend more time with their partner. It's this sort of really internally driven reason, I want to be with them more. And 17% said to test the relationship. Now, that group's always really interesting to us because, as we said at the outset, a lot of people believe that this will improve their odds of doing well in marriage. And then if you ask a little further, and the surveys show this, what people really believe is it's a great way to test things before you like double down in marriage. So why wouldn't you test the relationship? So next slide shows you the percentage of people divorced in our sample based on which top reason they gave. Galena, take it away.
So here, what we see is really important. So what we're finding is that testing the relationship or living together because it made sense financially, both of those are associated with a higher divorce, incidence of divorce. If you're moving in together because you want to spend more time with your partner, that sounds a little bit more like dedication than constraint commitment. It's inconvenient to live apart. There might be different reasons why it might be inconvenient, but you see that there's a little bump above spending more time with your partner in terms of divorce for that reason as well. So I think what's important here to recognize is if a couple is moving in together because of external reasons, like it's inconvenient or it makes sense financially, that could be kind of a warning sign for them that kind of commitment to one another by moving in together may not be the best move for them. If partners want to test the relationship, and I hope we might talk about this more in our questions, I think there are some better ways to test the relationship than living together, because if there's a need to test the relationship, while you may learn about some of the things that you're concerned about by living together, you've also increased the chances that you're going to stay together, which may not be the side effect that you want when you're interested in testing the relationship.
Yeah, I like to say on that, it's like in college, if somebody's not doing well in a course that they signed up for, but they missed the drop date for the, they can't just pull out of the course as easily. So it's not hard to believe that people get information living together. I mean, you could imagine that, but Galena's point earlier is there's a lot of ways to get information that don't involve increasing the constraints to continue the relationship. And it's a really important thing to think about there. Sometimes people are testing a relationship and they might get information, but the information's not the most easily actionable. As Galena said earlier, and Kay said, we really believe in actionable information. And once you're more constrained and it's getting harder to break up, that information you're getting is less actionable. Okay, next slide. Okay, we'll turn it over to you now because we're happy to entertain questions and discuss what's on people's minds.
We have some good questions here, not in any particular order, just my choice, I guess. So you had a list of all constraints. This is Julie from Tennessee. You had a list of all constraints that were more likely to keep people in a cohabiting relationship. I believe a baby was the least likely thing that would keep a couple together. So can you give us the top 10 constraints again, and do they include babies?
Well, Julie, you know your stuff. That is true that we've found in other research that having a child together does not actually decrease the risk of breaking up in a cohabiting relationship. Scott, do you have a sense of other constraints that may be on the top 10 list of constraints?
Well, there's things like, I mean, Galena wrote a great measure, and then there's a study on this that that Julie from Tennessee is asking about. It's that measure, right, Galena? I mean, so things like cell phone membership, like joining on your cell phone plan, of course, moving in together, buying something together, buying a car together, getting a gym membership together, introducing, you could see, I don't know if this is on your constraint list, Galena, but you could see how it could become a constraint too if you started to introduce this person in a more serious way to like your whole social network, things, I don't have like a top 10 list off the top of my head, but anything that starts to make it harder to move from the direction you're going a different direction. That's really what inertia is about, by the way, in physics, is it's how much force does it take to make an object do something different than what it's already doing. So relationships pick up inertia because of things people do. And cohabitation is, of course, really one of the biggies. But we think there's a whole lot of other kinds of things like that that start to really increase inertia. And in that study that the question is about, Galena's measure that she developed on those things, there's 25 things on that list. We could send it out or something if people want to see it. That predicted staying together net of how dedicated you were to this person more than whether you had a child with them, which is really kind of a stunning finding if you think about it.
So did you control for religiosity when you were looking at covariance and other things? Was that part of the equation, religiosity?
So, Galena,
you know, I think that's a great question to ask. One of the challenges with this kind of survey is it's not prospective. So all we could measure was religiousness at this point in time. We don't have a good way to measure religiousness at the time that they started living together or got married, and we know that changes over time. So Scott, jump in, but we decided in the end not to control for religiousness because it couldn't be measured at the time that people were living together or even getting a divorce.
So part of the thinking there is it's pretty easy for some, but we think, you know, there's always retrospective issues in this kind of design, but we think it's pretty easy for somebody to recall, well, was I employed when we got married? Were we engaged when we started living together? Did I have a college degree or not at that time? Have I ever had a college degree? But those kind of questions, my race, ethnicity, those sorts of things. Did I live with both of my biological parents at the age of 14? We think people can answer those questions pretty well. But other kinds of things you can ask somebody, I mean, as a case in point, you could ask somebody about, well, were you happy when you first married this person about marrying them? Well, that's got some retrospective bias for the people that were divorced, just like, were you religious? How religious were you? Because people, when they divorce, tend to become less religious, tend to become less observant. Their behavior changes, and just like things like happiness in the relationship change. So some things you can't control for well in this design because you have a pretty strong reason to believe that the experience of the marriage declining and divorce would change that and change how they remember it. Now, having said that, you can do things. We don't think this is a proper analysis, but we can do things like add present religiosity, religious behavior to the model and see if it really dings the findings any. And it really doesn't. I mean, you know, you can see some little changes in the findings, but a lot of things like that. Another really great example is, did the couple have a child or not while they were married? We want to know, did you have a child before the marriage? Because that's not deeply intertwined with how the marriage goes and whether the marriage makes it. But we don't control for whether you had a child after the marriage. So there's some things like that where we can control for them. We just don't think they belong in the main model, but they also generally don't really affect the findings. They don't make the findings go away. Let me just say that in terms of those main sort of things that we're predicting about timing.
All right, so the questions are pouring in. Someone with the initials WA, who is obviously a researcher, just saying, has 3 questions. So I'll just ask one at this point. Are there any subgroups of premarital cohabitors who have the same rate of divorce as non-premarital cohabitors, i.e. someone whose motivation is spending time with partner or has a higher SES or who has cohabited before?
I like that question. I don't know that we have looked at sort of specific profiles within that, but what's most important is the distinction between living together before becoming engaged versus after becoming engaged. So for those who live together only after becoming engaged, we don't see a higher risk for divorce compared to those who didn't live together at all. So that distinction is the most important one. But I think that's a really neat idea to kind of look at specific profiles of of people, including how they moved in together, their reasons, and the timing of engagement versus cohabitation.
I'll just add, nothing makes everything a sure bet, and nothing makes everything a guaranteed loss. I mean, so you can have people that sort of, by their own understanding or their own socio-cultural background, do everything right and struggle in marriage, and you can have people that sort of, even by their own definition, take a lot of missteps and sort of do everything out of sequence and do fine. So there's always many exceptions to any research finding. So the way we think about the part here that's we think is actionable is really that we're talking about things where people can give themselves an edge, where they could be a little more careful, where they could go a little more slowly in how they do things and maybe have a better outcome in life.
All righty.
Along those lines, sorry, Kay, I'll just jump in because this is a question that I would want to ask. Does it mean if you live together before you were engaged that your marriage is doomed? Would be one question I would want to know. And what Scott was saying, I think, is really important to recognize. No, that's not what that means, right? There's a lot of variation in different things that might explain outcomes. And one of the things that I think we would suggest to someone who maybe looks back and sees a history of sliding or wanting to test the relationship is to do some things now that might increase the decisions that you're making, communication about decisions, and being sure that from this point forward, you're really making decisions together that are based on your relationship and what's best for both of you and your family, and not sliding through experiences that might get you stuck into something that isn't a good fit for you.
So Connie asks, I am assuming that, quote, living together assumes that the couple is having sex together. Is there much difference in the research between, quote, living together compared to having sex together when it comes to marital outcomes? So if you're having sex but living in separate apartments, are your outcomes different, or do we know? Stump the stars.
I like that. I like that. I'm trying to think about how we have looked at that in other research, where we have found in other research that having had more partners, sex partners, is associated with poorer marital quality, and other research has shown that it's associated with a higher risk for divorce. Scott, can you think of a way that we've kind of tested that difference?
No, but I know long ago, Teachman was looking at whether people had only ever lived with their partner, who they married, and had only ever had sex with them. And I'm not sure some of those findings would hold up these days. But and this is true in this sample too, and it's in the appendix of the report. Those who have more sexual partners are more likely to see their marriages end. So, and that by itself is kind of a complicated literature. I think part of what's tricky about the question about have sex is you can ask people whether they had sex, but then you have to decide how many items you want to burn and what sex mean. What is sex? Like, how are you defining it? It's certainly true that it's a minority of folks that haven't had sex before they married in some way at this point, but people do different things with that question. So it's harder to study if you're not really going to do a careful interview. Whereas people, we think, can report pretty clearly, did we live together or not? Because we ask it in a very specific way that fits our theory. That means sharing a single address without either of you having another place to live. That's how we ask it, because that's where we think the constraints really loaded up on the cohabitation side.
Okay, this is an interesting one. Paul, excuse me, asks, could you discuss the relative significance of compatibility versus dedication commitment? In a long-term relationship, e.g. marriage, ? Contesting compatibility is often cited as a reason to cohabitate as a test run. So how important is compatibility versus dedication commitment?
Well, I want to quote my esteemed colleague Galena a moment, and whether we get to generating this list here or not, and we will in this report that comes out, there's a lot of ways to test compatibility that aren't ones that greatly increase your constraints to staying together. I mean, you can learn a lot about a person. You can explore a lot about the relationship and get to know each other. The other thing that's interesting about compatibility, and then I'll comment on the dedication part. Compatibility is really important, but you have to be careful about how you define it, because like personality compatibility is not apparently any big thing. I mean, the research doesn't really support that. And people sometimes, Samantha Joel has a really nice study. She's a social psychologist. I think it's her and Paul Eastwick, but where they find that they do some speed dating studies where people aren't really very good at predicting what they're actually gonna like, you know, who they're actually gonna want to be with, so that, you know, they can write down what they think they want. And I think some areas of compatibility are really huge and matter, like life beliefs, religious beliefs, philosophy of life. Want children or not is an amazing one. Like when you're doing counseling with a couple and they disagreed on that from before, like, did you think that was going to go away? I mean, there's biggies, but beyond that, people probably aren't very good at predicting who they're going to like being with. And Samantha Joel says something I think is really important, like pay a ton of attention to how you feel when you're with this person. Like that's really valuable information. And maybe there's ways to get information where you don't have to constrain yourself. Oh, I didn't mention the dedication thing. I think dedication is really a big deal. And when you have two people that can sustain it, it can overcome a lot. Commitment of that sort can overcome a lot of around the edges problems with incompatibility.
Great. Tracy from, I think you're from Mississippi. Does the research show how long is too long to cohabit without a commitment of marriage happening? Is there a, you know, a month you can stay together before you're committed, or is, you know, there's no difference?
I love that question. You know, on average, cohabitation is pretty short, at least in the US. People tend to either break up or move to marriage within a couple of years of starting to live together. So it tends to be a pretty short experience for most people. Is there a specific window? We have a colleague in London, in the UK, Harry Benson, who has written a book about this very idea, and he really believes in the 2-year rule in general. But I think that's a great question. I think it's really dependent on what's happening for the couple, and what their reasons are for living together, what their reasons are for not getting married, and probably their age in some ways as well. Scott, what do you want to add?
I'll just add, you know, when we started getting into this literature and in this line of work, it was right around the time, which I thought was pretty good timing, when the book He's Just Not That Into You came out. And, you know, they'd probably rewrite the title now, They're Just Not That Into You. But, you know, he, she, whoever it is just not that into you, was really kind of a prescient book, because it was really describing scenario after scenario where somebody's already really pretty in deep. They're living with this person, they've committed in different sort of ways in terms of they've become more constrained. Maybe they even have a child or not, but time is marching on and they're figuring out this person's really not going to go there with you. They're not a customer for committing to you in life. And I think as couples, when you have two people that are living together longer and longer, and one really knows they want to take that step into marriage, and they can't get the other to talk about it or sustain any movement toward it, it should be a pretty big warning sign for them if that's what they really want, is marriage.
So how does commitment and what's the D word? Dedication. Thank you, dedication, and love styles. For instance, Storage, Davis, and Todd. You know, there's several, Wilson and Moscato. So is there anything in the literature about love styles and dedication and commitment? Lisa from Colorado asked that.
Lisa, that's a great question. I don't know. I can't think of much research that has looked at love styles, nor kind of the connection between love styles and dedication or different kinds of commitments. Scott, can you think of anything that's
No,
a good question?
I would bet that falls into a similar place as the personality compatibility stuff. I mean, it's personality compatibility is probably not much of a thing, and dedication probably whoppingly out predicts it in terms of how a marriage can you both be really dedicated to each other is probably a more important question, even though less defined than things about styles and personalities.
So based on, when you think about selection theory, what characteristics specifically of those who choose to cohabit before marriage are associated with a higher risk of divorce? Beyond like lack of dedication and commitment, is there something else specific to the individual?
Scott, do you have a sense of that list?
Yeah.
There are a number of different kind of categories that we've looked at.
So things that put you on a higher selected risk for struggling in marriage: your parents divorced, your parents never married, your parents broke up, poverty makes marriage harder, less education, struggling with education, prior. This one's tricky because is this selection or not, but in what Galena showed in the first study we did empirically on cohabitation was that the people that were most likely to live together before engagement were the people that would also already be at greater risk on, and also including on dimensions like mental health and other characteristics of their lives, probably substance use history. There's a lot of things that people have experienced in life, and where you put them in terms of the cart or the horse about what causes what is an interesting question. But a number of things like that raise the risk of divorce, and they also make it more likely that people will have more partners before they try to settle down, that they'll move in faster, that they'll become constrained more easily. So, but I also want to go back to something Galena said, because one of the coolest studies I think we have is a relationship education related study, where what Galena does in this study published in 2015 and a sample that a study we all worked on together about using chaplains using PrEP in the military, is the analysis he did show that those in the control group, the people that had the risk for the people that lived together before marriage had all the risks of the poorer outcomes: lower relationship quality, divorce, etc. And the people that got the random assignment study, very rigorous, the people that got the intervention, their risk went away. Their risk was not the same as the control group at the end of it. So one of the morals of that story is people sometimes mistake selection for determinism, like it's baked in. You can't do, you can have risks, and you can learn some things that can lower those risks, and that's a really important message, especially for this audience.
Okay, thank you. We've had great questions. I'm going to prevail upon Galena and Scott, and there's a ton more questions. So when we archive this webinar, put up the slides, we'll put up the Q&A, so you'll be able to have your questions answered by Scott. I only wish it could go longer, but we have time. We have to get off the air here in 2 minutes. So next slide, please. Oh, Scott, you can, whatever. So thank you for joining us today. We'll put this up on our site. You can share it with colleagues. You can look at it again. Of course, if you have any questions, let us know. Next slide. And next month, we're going to be talking about the success sequence for young adults with Dr. Brad Wilcox and Wendy Wang. They are also putting out new research showing how some of the constraints around getting, or how the order you do things in and when you do them makes an impact on your economic success. Speaking about economic success, those of you who might be doing direct work with teenagers are in the teen pregnancy prevention space, there's big funding that just was dropped in the last 10 days. Go to our website under free resources, toolkits, and check out the Teen Pregnancy Prevention Toolkit. Happy to send you materials. There's also California money for behavioral health and trauma, another thing that people are writing for. So, phew, without further ado, want to thank Scott and Galena. Pleasure to have you with us today, and be on the lookout for a large document to answer all the rest of these amazing questions.